what was the most number of times that people went round? 4. Well, I think we should probably give you all and Alison a round of applause as our second. Thank you very much, Alison. And next up, we've got Chris Wright, who's an artist, researcher, and writer based in Nottingham. And sorry, what I should say is what you've got here is Alec Finley's work that Gary Thomas was talking about earlier and wasn't able to show, but this is it. Okay.
Shall we just let it loop and loop?
Otherwise you won't be able to see your presentation, so let's close that.
I've decided to do mine quite formally and sort of in some ways pseudo-scientific. So it's like in the manner of a proper paper. But there it falls down after the first page. So when I first heard about this symposium, What is Success, in the NVAN newsletter, I just ignored it. I thought, oh, it's got nothing at all to do with me. And then I sort of easily listed all these ways why it wasn't suitable for me, you know. The reasons like, oh, well, don't make much of a living as an artist. You know, I've got a good degree, no job. This piece of work didn't work. And last time I had an opening, I had 4 people there. And it's so easy to list all these ways. You know, you've all done it. We've all done this, you know, so you know exactly what I mean, I'm sure. And then I realised what I was doing was I was actually listing what I perceived as my failures. But then turning what is success to what is failure. And that was just had such immediate allure. I thought, oh, that is really interesting. So I tried to turn it round by asking, why was I not a failure? Like I'd asked, why was I not a success? In the same manner, I couldn't list my successes. All I could do was list my failures, and my successes were just a list of achievements that just went on my CV that were judged by everybody else. And this dichotomy, it sort of piqued my interest, and I began thinking of the measurement of success. But one of the first questions that I asked myself was, what's the opposite of failure? Is it success, or is it achievement, or critical acclaim? How are they measured or judged? And can there be a universal way of guidance so we sort of know which is which? I decided that for the sake of ease, that success was probably the best word. Achievement often has a sort of defined set of aims and goals, and it's often measured universally, such as exam results and things like that. But it is the result of success, but we don't always sort of think of achievement in that way. It's just something that goes on a piece of paper often. Critical acclaim is measured in the big wide world, and we have no control over it. So in the end, what I came up with was this. It's an opinion by person or persons unknown, often using a set of criteria that may or may not have relevance to create a value judgment that has nothing to do with anyone else except that particular person at that particular time and in that particular space. So in other words, it's just a very subjective opinion, and that can be said to be in the mind of the beholder. And I also think success or failure, from this, they can be seen as interchangeable. Just to illustrate this, I've used works from recent and current exhibitions. I was lucky enough to see these pieces one after the other, as the exhibitions just very slightly overlapped. But firstly, I'd like to clarify that I'm making no judgments about these pieces of work, personally, and all the inclusions here are based on observation and eavesdropping. So this first piece of work, it was from the Sensing Spaces exhibition at the Royal Academy, which has just closed. It's by Petzo von Elrichshausen. That's the first hurdle over, I've said that correctly. And sort of look at, you know, just wandering around and being in the space, it was overheard to be interesting, exciting, well made, located well within the space. And the most popular target audience was the under 10s, who thought this was wonderful and shot up and down the spiral staircases in the tower and terrorised everybody. The second piece of work is by Philida Barlow, Doc, in the Devine Gallery in Tate, Britain. This image has been taken by David Levine for The Guardian. I'm afraid it's not my image, as they didn't let me take photographs in there. The title of the article was called Embracing Mess, Absurdity and Precariousness. and I'm not sure whether that means that it was a success or a failure. But the comments overheard in this space were by a gentleman who placed himself at intersections of gallery and harangued passing viewers saying, "Is this art? Would you say it was art?" And he just tried to stop everybody going past. I managed to bypass him quite neatly, which I was quite proud of. But it just shows that you can't really judge a piece of work. We always say the viewer is often seen as the final judge, and their viewpoints differ from any other viewer, as well as from the artist and the curator. But the judgment of failure is often done by the artists themselves at the beginning of the process of their creation. And what I'm arguing here is that failure should be valued as part of an experimental practice, where knowledge comes equally from failure and from success, and may be seen as interchangeable with success when seen in those terms. The ideas are founded on my own practice methodology, which is based on experimentation, and the concept of the finished work presenting a set of proposals, and these can be interpreted in different and varied ways. As a methodology, I've examined my own way of working and looking at whether there's any psychological reasons within myself to see whether I'm lessening the effect of failure by, inverted commas, not finishing. But of course, there's no one answer for everyone or everything, but I still feel that failure is a vital tool in my practice. So thus failure runs concurrently with success and constantly vacillates between the two, and this paper aims to reconcile failure with knowledge and ultimately success. So giving these eyes a sort of pseudo-scientific base, I've deliberately started with a chart that looks at the development of a project. Obviously I can only reference my own methodology, and I sort of begin with an experience or a line of text or a process. And I often start with a mind map, which can be textual or visual, and it runs concurrently with a project and where things are added and taken away just as things happen in the development process. So this is my chart, my pretend science chart. Obviously the line in the middle is a sort of mean line, and I deliberately haven't put whether up or down is failure or success. But I'm sort of looking at the start of the project of being, you start with the ideas and it's just there. Then when you start to experiment, you have some trials, some failures, some successes. But then you get to a point where actually you've thought a little bit about it, but actually you get to a point where you don't know anymore what's happening. It's beyond what you've already known. And then everything becomes less regular, more irrational, and you get higher peaks and troughs. And this is where you sort of go off for a couple of days and think, oh, it's not working. And that's why you have to go off for a couple of days and spend a night in the pub, I think. But at the end of the project, I think you have to look on it not as an end, but as a beginning. And you're beginning on a new level, and you have this sort of ongoing development, and that's where you can take things to the next stage. And it's also maybe the start of a new project or just a continuation of the same one. So this way of working was apparent in my recent residency at Harrington Mill Studios, where the gallery space became one of constant flux, and I was trying to understand the nature of that particular space. So I started with no preconceived idea of what I would produce, and this was the first work that emerged. The space was measured with a roll of foam tape. I'd found it that morning. I'd cycled up to the space, and by the side of the road was this big roll of sort of bright yellow foam tape, and I thought that actually looks really interesting. So because I had no idea what to do, I decided I would measure the space with this foam, and I attached one side to the wall, as you can see from the far side, and I just took the tape to the other side and cut it off. But I kept doing it over and over again, different pieces of tape, the same piece of tape. But every time I did it, the measurement was different. Because the tape was stretching, it just gave different lengths every time. So it sort of confirmed that measurement was potentially ambiguous. And I actually thought that was really a sort of interesting analogy for how we use judgment and what we think about, and whether it is failure or success is different every time. Ultimately, the tape was stretched to breaking point, and the image shows the tapes where, having stretched several lengths until they all broke in different places. So what emerged from that residency was a series of interruptions that could each be seen as a set of proposals, which were then developed into something else. In other words, I was not necessarily presenting finished work, although some of the work could be said to be finished. It was not necessary to judge each interruption, but to measure it against something else, but to view each as a proposition that could be a starting point and able to be built upon. Therefore, each change was seen as part of a whole rather than an individual work. So I've just got 3 slides of the sort of next sort of developments of this work, and they actually don't look as though they follow on, but it was just the process of being in the space and thinking about the space. The residency actually wasn't funded, and overall I actually spent £2.37 in 2 months on the residency. I'm not necessarily proud of that, but I do think that was actually an achievement. The strips here are used cycle inner tubes. When the cycle shops get punctures, they throw them away rather than mend them, I suppose. So this is cut up strips of inner tube. So using this sort of method, I feel as though it can be followed for your whole art output, where rather than judging each piece where failure could be a more easily accessible final context, if you look at the work in its entirety, you have more chance of actually gauging where it is. For this residency, following a judgmental line of practice, each piece could be seen as a series of failures, as each work failed to adequately answer the initial query, which was to create a discourse within the space which would show how change in the landscape, which is here the gallery, was an evolving concept rather than a standalone, with the aim of understanding the nature of the space in relation to the work. And these are my strategies for creating flux in the environment. It's aligned to my own personal process of making art and making inquiries. So from this piece of work, and there were lots of pieces of work in between, I've just chosen 3. During the residency, I did quite a lot of collaborations. The piece of work at the back, the sort of hanging coat rack, was part of an initial piece of work which sort of created a sort of domestic interior with a mirror that was given to me, and it shows my collection of found knots. I've been collecting used knots for quite a long time, and I hung them as though they were coats on this rack. And then another artist came along with this box, and in the box was her collection of found and used knots. So we put them together. And from that we decided to create this sort of huge net, which is sort of divides the gallery into 2. It's made of inner tubes again. The inner tubes that had already been used were then knotted together and used again. Some of the yellow foam tape, bits of ropes that I used to moor my boat, which meant I couldn't go anywhere in it for a little while, and some dyed string from an old picture frame, which was used to hang the picture frame. So each change altered the outcome subtly and added to my knowledge of the nature of the gallery environment at a particular time. And they also added to the knowledge of my own personal methodology, as well as developing my art practice. On reflection, it could be seen that working this way created a fluid process that engendered numerous thoughts and an ongoing line of inquiry. The potential of this is that the methodology can be tested in a new location, and by doing that it brings forth a completely new set of results. And I actually think this is particularly important, as you genuinely expect that a testing process will bring, well, scientifically you would expect the testing process would bring the same set of results and sort of identical results, but actually here it always brings a different set. And I think if it was the same, my methodology would actually have failed. So what I'm hoping for is a different set of results for every time. So one of the later pieces of work from this residency, didn't think it was going to be that one. I change my slides so often. So this is using the same sort of methodology of netting, but this is with gifted videotapes. So each one of these pieces actually has a name that aligns to the film. So we've got Independence Day, The Grinch, The Colour of Money, an unknown homemade video that could be anything from Disney to porn, and I quite like that unknowingness. And they're all woven and knotting together, so it's like creating new narratives. So some of them have been made into columns, and some of them have been nets which have just been dropped. So it almost looks like a sort of destruction scene in some parts. And I've used lights and filters to create a different colour environment. So using open-ended thinking, that is to produce a set of proposals and methodology, can be seen through a particular situation that's described by Jean-Paul Sartre in Being and Nothingness. He describes an event that he enters a cafe to meet who I presume is his friend Pierre. But when he gets there, Pierre isn't there. There are other people there, and not always people. He was expecting Valerie and Wellington to be there, but they weren't there either. But that is totally irrelevant. All he's focusing on is Pierre, and Pierre is not there. It's just... So, the absence of Pierre, the failure to be present becomes an event. And there could have been other outcomes where, even in Pierre's absence, but focusing on that one thing, Sartre fails to find satisfaction. An open-minded approach could have presented another but different satisfactory encounter, and the event could be seen as presenting an unlimited set of proposals. So what I'm looking at is the idea of failure becoming an event, a sort of opposite to all of it. If you look at it very narrowly, it is an event and a one-off. But if you look at it as a whole, you could actually see a lot of different scenarios. So I'm suggesting that actually we should just be very open-minded in how we think about things. So absence as opposite to present can be seen as a positive, as a success, just as much as presence would have. The presence of a valid outcome is a conventional concept, whereas the presence of absence of a valid outcome, that could be an invalid outcome or not to have an outcome at all, is often seen as failure. My methodology presents this absence as having the potential for success. Pierre's absence from the cafe could thus be seen as having a potential of numerous outcomes. Focusing on the one event is therefore limiting, and the practice and process of art should be seen as a whole. Of course, this is only one interpretation of the events, and there are obviously very many scenarios that could be put forward. So what I'm suggesting is that the focus has to be broad and opportunities gathered, rather than having a limited focus which can lead to a narrow practice. My interpretation of the cafe event is, however, subjective, and it's manipulated for my own results. It's my interpretation of that event. The nature of failure or success is also subjective, and in the same way. This subjectivity relates to the status of the person judging the work, who judges who and what is this work measured against. Some people find failure at the same time as others see success. So lastly, I made a mind map which summarised some of the ideas that I presented and expanded on the notion of judgment in relation to the concept of failure within art practice. I'm hoping we can see all these words. That's it. So if you can see on the left-hand side, we look at who judges and different types of viewer, and on the right-hand side it's just different ideas about success, achievement and experimentation. I actually think the nature of who judges is actually really important. I mean, initially you judge your own work, and of course when somebody else judges your own work, they don't necessarily see what you're seeing. And I've expanded the idea of viewer into both professional and amateur viewer. The amateur viewer being a passerby, somebody who just drops in, somebody who goes to see exhibitions but doesn't know a lot about art, just likes the aesthetics of it. And the professional viewer, who I've split into artist, stakeholder, curator and academic. And I think it's really important when you're looking at failure and why you perceive something as failure, who is actually making these judgments, because the stakeholder will have a different view from the curator and a different view from the academic. The stakeholder being the person who maybe sponsors the gallery or has some sort of stake in that exhibition. I mean, we always think of, I've included the creator later, farther down as well, because they seem to hold the keys, don't they? They're the gateway to our success, or can be perceived that way in some way. I also looked at the idea of the amateur viewer from the very particular exhibitions, such as the Lowry exhibition at the Lowry Gallery in Manchester. And if you go into that exhibition, it's full of people who are not looking at the paintings, but trying to guess where places are. And that was just like my mother in those days. And it's like a nostalgia event rather than an examination of the work. And that does actually give a whole different idea to the exhibition. So what I'm suggesting is that failure and success of your own work should be measured by the artist alone, and that critical engagement must be part of the artist's skill set, however painful it often is. My aim, therefore, is to have a successful failure that is the result of experimental and open-minded practice, with acknowledgement of opinions and judgments held, but not holding them to ransom and stifling your output. So I aim to value failure as a path of knowledge, but be good at it. That's it. Thank you. Thank you. Does that escape? It is. Thank you.